All right, H period. Here we go with our recap of the lecture that we skipped on Friday. To begin with, protagonist of the Adam and Eve story, that would obviously be Adam. Antagonist would be the serpent. So we have a Adam versus the serpent scenario. Now we trace our plot from rising action through the conclusion of the story, through the resolution, primarily so that we don't overlook any key events. That's one of the biggest temptations, or should I say weaknesses, toward having a weak analysis, is when you're only looking at how it ends, or you're only looking at the big, most climactic moment. So let's start with rising action. It starts with the making of Adam from dirt. Then we have the prohibition of the trees. Then we have the naming of the animals, but he can't find the right companion among them. And then we have the making of Eve from his side, symbolizing the fact that she's his helper. Then our climax is very obviously the tree event, the eating of the fruit, the falling to temptation, what we call the fall of mankind, where mankind goes from innocent to guilty. Then we have our falling action. We're going to pay close attention to this as well. This is the falling action and rising action is what we often ignore when we're trying to do an analysis. So right after the tree, we have the feelings of shame, the reaction of hiding and lying, the reaction of putting on clothes for the first time, and then God's reaction is to level those three curses. The resolution of the story is that they get kicked out of Eden because they no longer are qualified to live in paradise. Moving on to the next section. We're using the same terms that we did in the lesson before. So if you've got the notes from Thursday in front of you, we're following that exact same pattern. So the next thing would be structure and motif. There's not really much to say regarding structure and motif about this particular tale. I don't see any motifs, and the structure is just chronological. We meet Adam, we see what happens in order, and then it ends when they're out. So there's not much to say in this category. And you will find that that's sometimes the case. Not every literary device or technique is going to show up in every story. So we take it where we can get it. We find it where it exists. The next part is to choose a major device that's worth talking about. So major devices might be irony. I don't see any irony here. Archetype, symbolism, a point of view that has an effect, anything that's big. So of our options, I think I'm going to go with archetype. Just like we talked about the archetype in Genesis 1 being light and 7, this is still very archetypal. We have this archetypal snake who's evil, just like we always think about snakes in almost every other culture and in countless movies and fairy tales and so forth. The snake is the evil character. And another possibility is to look at the tree as a symbol. Now, I know that this is an interpretive option. There are a lot of people who look at the story as being an accurate storytelling that's historical of what actually happened. But if you look at the name of this tree, it sounds really symbolic. So we're at least going to open up the possibility of the tree being symbolic. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So it's definitely representing something abstract. We've got a thing representing an idea. So what I noticed that's kind of interesting here is that the tree is symbolizing the knowledge of good and evil. And the minute that they actually become evil, they become aware of evil in the world. Plus, we have this archetypal snake that represents evil. So this story definitely has something to do with an awareness of what's right and what's wrong, this knowledge. And if you'll remember back to the quiz that you took several days ago, I asked you what was the thing that the snake used to tempt Adam and Eve with? Was it pleasure? Was it beauty? And the answer was wisdom. So this story definitely has a lot to do with knowledge and wisdom, and in particular, the difference between being good and bad. Okay, so the next and last category would be poetic devices. And this is where we look a little bit more closely at the use of language, and we look at imagery or figurative language or anything that looks kind of artistic or poetic. And I can't help but notice, particularly the way that the text is laid out on the page, is that there's 4 times where the storyteller breaks into poems. The first time is when Adam first sees his wife, and he breaks into what you might call a love poem. He says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." So hopefully you can hear that repetition that we talked about last week as being very distinctively Jewish. They just didn't do rhyme in the ancient times. And the Jews were particularly fond of saying the same thing twice, but in a slightly different way. And, we can always ask, what's the purpose of breaking into poetry? What's the purpose of getting repetitive? Why say something twice when you don't need to say it twice for informational reasons? There's got to be other reasons. So it could be emphasis, it could be elegance, it could be beauty. So maybe the reason why the storyteller breaks into poetry here is because it's emotional, it's love. But what about those other 3 moments? There are 3 other spots where the storyteller clearly breaks into poetry. They're curse poems, which I probably shouldn't be laughing at a curse poem, but there is to me something a little bit entertaining about the fact that the curses are given in poetry. So why? Why does God break into poetry? Because God speaks in other points in the story. But when God makes these pronouncements, he uses poetry. My best guess is that there's something poetic about the curses themselves. I think that they have a poetic justice to them. So at the very least, they're getting emphasized. These moments when God curses people, these moments are getting emphasized even more than Eve's creation or the naming of the animals. Those parts are just coming to you in regular everyday prose, but we've got these 3 poems. So let's take a look at those really quick and see what's special about them. So the serpent poem, and we've already talked about this a little bit from the quiz, because I did ask you about enmity, and there's a footnote, so I shouldn't have to say too much right now because you can always go back and look at the text and reread your footnote. But in this story, what's happening with the snake is when we first met him, he was up in the tree, and he was being very clever as he twisted the truth to tempt Adam and Eve into doing something wrong. And he basically wins in this attempt to mess things up. So look at how poetically elegant and look at the justice in his conviction here. That he's going to have to go from up in the tree to down on the ground. He's going to have to live on his belly and eat dust all the days of his life. So he's going from high to low. And then it also says that snakes and human beings are going to hate each other forever. Again, poetic justice seems kind of fair. The snake came around and screwed everything up, so of course they're going to get hated forever. And furthermore, the snake's not always going to win when it comes to snake versus human. It says that the descendants of Adam and Eve are going to bruise the head of the snake, while the snake is only able to bruise our heel. So basically, we're going to be enemies with the snake forever, but the snake can only hurt our foot. We have the upper hand now. We can hurt the snake's head. So I want you to see the poetic justice in that curse, and I feel like that might be the reason for the poetry. Let's look at the woman's curse. I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. So you can hear the poetic repetition. What's getting emphasized is the sorrow. This is a sad thing. And once again, we're getting this poetic justice. She was made, if you remember, from his side to be his companion, and the text says she's to be his helpmeet, or his helper. She's not being very helpful here, though, in asking him to be disobedient. So she says, I want you to do this. He says, okay, and he eats the fruit. God says, let's get some poetic justice here. We'll flip this around. You're going to want things from your husband, but he is going to be the ruler over you. You don't get to make the first move anymore. You don't get to be the boss at all anymore. And in fact, her very femininity gets cursed, because now she's going to have pain when she has babies. This really bothers me as a woman, but it does kind of explain the attitude toward women that we see throughout the Old Testament, and really, in fact, most ancient cultures. One more curse poem. Adam. Cursed is the ground for thy sake, in sorrow shalt thou eat of it. You're going to have thorns and thistles, you're going to sweat, and then at the end of it all, you're going to return into the ground where you started. One more time, poetic justice, balance, it makes sense. He was given the garden. The garden was given to Adam, because that happened before Eve ever even existed. All the trees were given to Adam. He only had one expectation: don't eat from these 2 particular trees, but you've got 100 other ones. He messes it up, so the answer is, okay, you can't handle living in the garden, you don't get a garden anymore, you're going to have to get out, you're going to have to do your own farming, and it's going to be hard. You're going to sweat, there's going to be thorns, there's going to be thistles, and I'm not going to kill you right here and now like I originally said. This is where the mercy comes in. God had originally said, on the day that you eat of the tree, you will die. God kind of reels it back, because I see a little compassion here. But Adam is going to have to die now. It will just be eventually he will return. He will turn back into dirt, which of course is where he began. So again, there's this poetic balance and poetic justice to this poetry that we find mixed in to the prose of the story. That completes our chart, except for the very bottom level, which is when we try and draw a conclusion. So now we look back at all of the things that we've noticed. We look back at what we've written down, what we've taken notes on, and we go, other than the obvious didacticism, do good or get in trouble, right? That's there, but we're going to push it to the side for a moment, and we're going to use our literary analysis to see if there's anything else that might be a little bit more interesting in a philosophical way. So if we look back over our notes, I definitely see 2 other topics that present themselves for some thematic consideration. We've got the issues of knowledge, and particularly of the knowledge between good and evil. And then the secondary one we have is the issues of gender that are established here with the woman and the way she's created and where she comes from and what she's called, the helpmeet, and then of course the curses. So what kind of themes can we pull out of this? Let's look at those topics and create some themes, and then we will call it a day. That was a very, very fast Friday. Patriarchy. Women are naturally, women need to be second in command. I think that's something that we could pull out of the story. Now, agree with it or don't agree with it, and I definitely don't agree with it. Our job isn't to really to agree or to disagree. We notice what the story is saying, and then we can talk about it. Do you like what Genesis has to say about women? So we definitely have patriarchy theme, and now let's draw a theme about knowledge or good and evil. And we want to try and stay away from the didacticism for now. We want to try and stay away from something like you have to stay away from evil or you're going to get punished, or God is good and we're not. Let's move that aside. And I really think that it's a lot more about the nature of knowledge. The human beings here were tempted to do something wrong by the allure of knowing as much as God, as having wisdom. And on the surface, that doesn't sound like a very bad thing. Don't we want to know the truth? Don't we want to know a lot of things? Isn't learning stuff and knowing stuff great? I mean, that's why we're at school, right? The story seems to say that there's a dangerous side to knowledge. There's a dangerous side to knowing things. There's a dangerous aspect to information. First thing that comes to mind when I think about this theme is the internet. When it was invented, we thought, fantastic, we've got this new invention where everybody can access this limitless information whenever they want to. Turns out it has a negative side. It's easy to lie on the internet, just like we learned in our media unit, and like we see with the snake here. Sometimes having a lot of information isn't a good thing. You can get overwhelmed with too much information and not know what matters anymore. And I think I'll stop there because I'm pretty sure that you guys could quite easily explain the dangerous side of having all this information at our fingertips with the internet. So we've got 3 major themes. One is obvious, the issues of obedience. We've also got issues of patriarchy and gender roles, and then we've got the issues of knowledge and wisdom. And that wraps us up for our formal criticism. Make sure you remember that term, should be in your notes, our formal criticism of Genesis 2 and 3. And I hope you feel like there's more to this story than you thought there was 16 minutes ago. And that's why we're learning to apply analytical thinking to the Bible text. The end. See you later.